And this week on Face the Nation, has the banking crisis cooled, or are we in for another wild week? Plus, former President Trump says he expects to be arrested this week, and no surprise, that set off a political firestorm. Politics are out in full force as former President Trump rallies his supporters ahead of a possible indictment in the Stormy Daniels hush money investigation. Robert Costa will join us with new reporting. Then, after two banks collapsed and another received an infusion of cash from some of the nation's biggest banks to keep it on life support, what's the prognosis for the banking industry and the impact on our economy?
Our banking system is sound. Americans can feel confident that their deposits will be there when they need them.
Americans can rest assured.
In public, officials say there's nothing to see here. But what's going on behind the scenes to shore up banking stability? We'll talk with the head of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry, and industry critic, Senator Elizabeth Warren. Former Trump administration economic advisor Gary Cohn will also be here. Plus, we'll talk to tech watchers Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway about the stability of the sector as the head of the embattled social media giant TikTok prepares to testify before Congress. Vladimir Putin makes a bold trip to occupy Ukraine following a tense week between the U.S. and Russia and ahead of a meeting with China's President Xi. Former Trump National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster will join us for analysis. It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. We had a sense of deja vu early Saturday when former President Trump hit send on a social media post saying he, quote, will be arrested on Tuesday. Protest, take our nation back. He's referring to the Manhattan case focusing on the alleged hush money payments he made to porn star Stormy Daniels late in the 2016 campaign. That grand jury is still hearing testimony and will need to vote as to whether or not Mr. Trump should be indicted. But his urging support from his followers in advance has caused a political firestorm and has prompted additional security concerns. If Mr. Trump is indicted, that would be yet another first. No sitting or former president has ever been indicted. Our Robert Costa has been reporting on the investigations. He's here with me now. I know you have been speaking to the Trump legal team. What is the broader strategy?
Robert, good morning. Speaking to Trump's lawyer, Joe Tacopina, and other close allies of the former president, it's evident that in the coming days, with regard to a possible indictment, the legal strategy is going to be combative. They are going to question the scope of any possible felony that's issued for former President Trump. They're going to talk about the timing, and they're going to attack the credibility of Michael Cohen, the longtime Trump lawyer and Trump fixers who's at the center of this case over his payment. But there's a lot of debate in the inner circle about how combative to be, including the use of the word protests in the former president's social media language over the weekend. There's some consternation among some allies privately. Maybe that's a bit too far, but they do want to see solidarity with his supporters.
You're gesturing to security concerns there, too. Tell me about what's being planned. This is unprecedented territory. Bringing in a former president for potential indictment, how does this work?
What's so surprising in the reporting is that there's not much planning going on, at least between the Trump camp and the Manhattan district attorney. People close to the former president say there are real gaps, tensions between the DA and the Trump team about how this could unfold, whether there would be a perp walk or cameras or the former president walking in, whether he would have a private entrance or not. What we do know is that the Manhattan district attorney, Alvin Bragg, has informed his own colleagues that he will do everything he can to keep them safe, knowing the former president has called for protests. There's a lot of unease inside the Manhattan DA's office at this time. Whenever there is an indictment, should it come, it would be coordinated by NYPD and Secret Service and other authorities. CBS News has learned there are some conversations among those entities at this moment.
This is also obviously a huge political story. Senator Lindsey Graham said yesterday the prosecutor in New York, quote, has done more to help Donald Trump get elected president than any single person in America today. Is that how the Trump camp sees it?
Well, Senator Graham is a longtime advisor and friend of former President Trump, and the Trump wing of the Republican Party sees this as a very similar moment to what happened when the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago, that this is going to create a lot of momentum for the former president in the 2024 race. And what you saw over the weekend right now is a lot of calls for Republicans to speak out in defense of Trump, to come out and say, we're with him. The DA's out of line. There's been pressure on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to speak up more loudly about what is happening to Trump. Some DeSantis allies say they want to have him stay in his own lane. You see former Vice President Mike Pence. He is speaking up, calling any possible indictment politically charged, but he's not trying to weigh in too much on the specifics of the case. That's the balancing act you see from so many Republicans right now. Show anger towards the DA, but don't necessarily rally too much around Trump's side.
Right. And the Trump campaign has been issuing press releases, raising money off of this, and trying to call out those who haven't spoken yet in the former president's defense. But this is just one case in Manhattan. We know there are many other issues legally here, including at the Justice Department with what the special counsel is pursuing. What can you tell us about that?
I can't underscore enough how my reporting shows that while this is a lot of activity in Manhattan in the district attorney's office, the federal grand jury investigation of January 6th is very serious. And former Vice President Mike Pence could face a crossroads this week, whether he will testify or not. We're told by sources the chief judge may force him to testify, but Pence will raise an argument on constitutional grounds that as a former president of the Senate, he should not have to testify about his conversations with Trump about January 6th.
All right. Bob Costa, I know you'll have a busy week ahead. Thank you for all your reporting. We want to turn now to our other big story, the banking crisis. We go to Boston and Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren. Good morning to you, Senator.
Good morning.
We saw this multi-billion-dollar attempt by the biggest banks to shore up one of the regional banks, First Republic. And even that hasn't stopped the anxiety in the banking sector right now. Do you think that in order to stop the bleeding, one of those big banks, too big to fail, needs to be able to buy up that smaller bank?
So I think that right now what we're trying to do is figure out the different ways to shore up these banks.
Do you need to allow for a merger? And is there any other white knight who could come in to save one of these regional banks, like First Republic?
Look, right now, the one who's saving all of these banks is the federal government. And the
First
federal
Republic's
government
still
is doing
living.
it through
It's still an actively traded company. It's not a failed bank.
I understand that. The point is right now, the Treasury Department, the Fed, all of the government regulators, the FDIC, are trying to fire on all cylinders to try to figure out what they can do to prop up these banks. And the point I was trying to make is the reason they're doing this is because this whole tranche of banks has been under-regulated for 5 years now. And people are very concerned about when you lift the hood, what's under the hood, since the regulators clearly have not been on top of their job. It's the reason that I'm calling right now for changes in the Fed in its regulatory approach and changes in Congress so that we roll back the authorization to lighten those regulations.
Well, I know there's some dispute on the regulation. You're talking about a tweak in 2018 to Dodd-Frank, and I know Barney Frank, one of the authors of that original regulation, is a dispute with you in regard to what actually happened here. But I want to talk about the now.
I wouldn't call it a tweak.
Well, Senator, though, I want to ask you about what Congress can do now, because it would be up to Congress to lift the FDIC insurance levels for those deposits above $250,000. In this environment we are in, do you think there's will in Congress to do that?
I think that lifting the FDIC insurance cap is a good move. Now the question is, where's the right number on lifting it? But recognize that we have to do this because these banks are under-regulated. And if we lift the cap, we are requiring or relying even more heavily on the regulators to do their jobs.
Where would you lift that cap to?
The government is backing them up.
And
this
for how long?
This is a question we got to work through. Is it 2 million? Is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? Small businesses need to be able to count on getting their money to make payroll, to pay the utility bills. Nonprofits need to be able to do that. These are not folks who can investigate the safety and soundness of their individual banks. That's the job the regulators are supposed to do.
Well, I want to get to that particular point in a moment, but back on this, are you talking to the White House currently about a proposal on lifting the FDIC insurance levels? Are they asking you to do that? And is this possible to pass?
I don't want to talk about private conversations, but I will say it is one of the options that's got to be on the table right now.
There were already requirements and public disclosures here, and there were flashing red lights. In December, SVB reported to the SEC it had no interest rate hedges on its bond portfolio. In March, the San Francisco Fed, this is publicly available, noted the banks in that district had the largest pace of decline in withdrawals in the country, perhaps due to higher exposure to accounts above $250,000. So this was already out there in the public space. Why didn't the chief regulator in Silicon Valley area, the San Francisco Federal Reserve, act here? Do you have confidence in its president, Mary Daly?
No, I do not. The Fed should have acted, both the San Francisco Fed and the Federal Reserve Bank. Remember, the Federal Reserve Bank and Jerome Powell are ultimately responsible for the oversight and supervision of these banks. And they have made clear that they think their job is to lighten regulations on these banks. We've now seen the consequence of this.
This was missing signals of what's out there. Do you think then, what's the consequence for regulators in San Francisco and Washington?
So, look, this is the point I've been trying to make all along. Jerome Powell has said that all he wants to do is lighten regulations on the banks. I opposed him as chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank precisely for that reason. I said he was a dangerous man to have in this position.
You opposed him when President Biden reappointed him as well. You opposed him consistently. I understand that.
I opposed him both times.
I understand
that. That's exactly right. And for exactly this reason. Because what he has done all along is lightened regulations on the banks.
Do you worry, though, in this moment where we have this crisis of confidence that you are sowing more distrust of the federal government right now?
Well, what I'm doing is being honest about what's gone wrong. I don't think you build any trust at all if you don't start with why it's broken and who it is, excuse me, that is responsible for that. We need accountability for our regulators who clearly fell down on the job, and that starts with Jerome Powell. And we need accountability for the executives of these large financial institutions. Look, there should be clawbacks for Gary Becker and the others who explode these banks. So you take back the bonuses and big salaries. We should, it certainly should, on both sides there should be support for this. And we should also bar them from ever being in banking again. We do that with stockbrokers. We should do the same thing with bankers.
Elizabeth Warren, thank you very much, Senator, for your time.
Thank you.
We are joined now by the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, North Carolina Congressman Patrick McHenry. Good morning. Good to have you here in person.
Great to be here.
I want to go into the banking crisis, but I first want to ask you about a bit of business in regard to what Speaker McCarthy has said. He's directing Congress to investigate, he tweeted, whether federal funds are being used by the state of New York, where a grand jury may soon indict the 45th president. Why is he issuing this threat? And isn't this kind of congressional investigation just using federal funds from U.S. taxpayers on a political errand?
I think the viable question for the American people is whether or not you have a progressive prosecutor using the justice system to go after political enemies for a political splash. And that seems to be the case here with the Manhattan DA.
But you're trying now to focus on things of substance that are at crisis level in the banking sector. Should one of the too big to fail banks, the large, systemically important banks, be able to step in here and buy up a troubled bank like First Republic?
I think all options should be on the table.
Is there anything that would block that kind of white knight rescue?
What I need to get to the bottom of investigatively in Congress is who, what, when, where, why, and how of these bank failures and the decisions made
Signature
over-
and Silicon Valley.
That's right. And then the decision made over the weekend. We saw a private sector response to help support a bank.
Right.
Was that a viable option last weekend, or was there an ideological lens that prevented them from taking these institutions and making it less turbulent for America?
That's why I was asking the question I asked you, because what you're suggesting there is that the Biden administration didn't want a big bank to come to the rescue here.
We don't know that.
And we're now in a continued crisis. You don't have an answer to.
I don't have the facts on whether or not the FDIC had a viable buyer last weekend. We have press reports of two banks that were at the table. We have comments from other bankers that they were prevented from bidding. I don't have the facts, and until I have the facts, I'm not going to draw a conclusion.
But you're
Especially in a moment
suggesting
like
it could have
this.
made things worse.
Well, I think we know we had a very rough week for American banking, and we lost confidence. And I think that raises the questions of what happened last weekend.
You did hear Senator Elizabeth Warren suggest that she would favor a congressional initiative to lift the insurance on currently uninsured deposits, those above $250,000. She put a cap of $2 to $10 million. For how long? How big? Who does it apply to? How would you craft that? Do you see a chance to work here?
Well, it's the first time I've heard a proposal like that. And I have not had a single conversation with the White House or the administration about deposit insurance changing the levels. What I will do, though, legislatively and an oversight function is determine whether or not we need to address the FDIC deposit level. We did it after the last financial crisis, raising from $100,000 to $250,000.
You're calling in the head of the FDIC and the vice chair for supervision for the Fed's Board of Governors. What is your intent? And will you call up Mary Daly, the head of the San Francisco Federal Reserve?
We need to understand the decisions that were made last weekend, from Thursday until Sunday night, on whether or not there's a viable private sector solution. We also need to understand the underlying causes of the collapse of these banks, and we're going to get to that. The question of the San Francisco Fed is a question of supervision. We need to get to the bottom of whether or not this is a supervisory problem, a regulatory problem, a bank mismanagement problem, perhaps all three. In all frankness,
I want to ask you about some of the things being said. Populist politics around banking, everyone engages in.
It never ends.
It never ends. But the two banks that did fail, they were in New York and they were in California. Conservatives like Mike Pence, Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, your colleague James Comer, they're throwing around terms like woke banks advancing the liberal agenda. They're blaming diversity and environmental initiatives. Isn't there a danger in casting a very substantive, active crisis in terms of a culture war?
I think everyone's preaching their book, and that's what we heard in your first segment.
Right. But you agree that's not helpful?
Their book, and their book is, well, if they thought it was a problem a month ago, they apply it to this circumstance. That's happening on both sides of the aisle. But when it comes to the question of ESG and these initiatives,
Environmental
social and
initiatives,
governance,
right, and the encouragement of companies to take that into consideration with their investment.
Yes. So there has been a lot of political debate about that. There is substance here. And if the management of these institutions was much more concerned about politics or the environmental or social goods rather than the governance regulations, ensuring you had a capable board, you had proper oversight of people's deposits, then this shows they had mismanagement. So I think there are
Do you have
natural
evidence of
questions
that?
we have.
There wasn't a risk officer fully at Silicon Valley Bank for an extended period of time.
Yes, and you had very few people that had banking expertise on the board of the bank. So there's some questions, natural questions we should raise.
But that's that's bad management. That's not woke banking, whatever
But
that
as I
means.
said, whatever your book of business was as a politician a month ago, a year ago, is applied to this general circumstance. What I'm trying to do is get to the details of what happened and have and then determine whether or not there's a proper legislative response.
Yes.
But when you have a hammer, you look at the world as a nail.
Right.
And that's what we see out of politicians.
So President Biden has asked Congress so far, maybe he asked for other things. The only thing he's asked for so far is to be able to claw back salaries of those or pay to executives of failed banks and then to ban them from working in the financial industry. This already exists for the great big banks. Senator Warren supports that. Does that pass Congress?
Well, it's something I'm going to look at and consider.
But it doesn't have to do with the active crisis.
No, it does. It doesn't. But in response to these things, we know that there are known failures of this. We saw, for instance, deposits perform in a different way than regulators assumed. That uninsured deposits left at a more rapid rate than insured deposits. That's a new phenomenon. When we have the speed of Twitter and a bank run, and the speed of electronic banking, those things are things that we need to look at legislatively and regulatorily.
Yeah.
The question of performance of bank executives, we certainly need to look at that and make sure that they're aligned with consumer protection and depositor interest.
Congressman, we'll be watching your upcoming hearing. Thank you. Face the Nation.
First of all, what has caused this, I'll say it again, is the oil petroleum tycoons that raised the prices of oil, that made all kinds of all-time profits last year above and beyond any other year. They'd done that on the tail end of COVID after people had already been destabilized. That's really the bottom line in regards to that. But if you'll back up and listen to this one more time, listen to
Nation will
this.
be back in a minute.
Hang on. Hang on. Right there.
Out of politicians.
So President Biden has asked Congress so far, maybe he asked for other things. The only thing he's asked for so far is to be able to claw back salaries of those or pay to executives of failed banks and then to ban them from working in the financial industry. This already exists for the great big banks. Senator Warren supports that. Does that pass Congress?
Well, it's something I'm going to look at and consider.
But it doesn't have to do with the active crisis.
No, it does. It doesn't. But in response to these things, we know that there are known failures of this. We saw, for instance, deposits perform in a different way than regulators assumed. That uninsured deposits left at a more rapid rate than insured deposits. That's a new phenomenon. When we have the speed of Twitter and a bank run, and the speed of electronic banking, those things are things that we need to look at legislatively and regulatorily.
Yeah.
The question of performance of bank executives, we certainly need to look at that and make sure that they're aligned with consumer protection and depositor interest.
Or is it possible that they knew that they was already in trouble and they basically started this fear tactic, fear-mongering, and out of the fear-mongering, they know that people is going to be willing to take a chance. Let's say if you got a CD or IRA in there and it's worth $100,000. Well, to pull it out early, you're going to take a big hit, like a 20% hit on that CD or that IRA. Well, you know who gets that money whenever you got to pay that penalty to get that $100,000 out? You'll basically get, I don't know, it'll probably cost you about 10 grand, maybe a little more, to get that out. It may not be a full 20%, but you know who's going to come out on top of that? The shareholders, the banks. And that's what they're counting on. That's what they're gambling on. That's what they're betting on. They know that they have failed because of what the oil industry has done. Rather than blame them, it's easier to create this fear-mongering tactic. That way, maybe they'll still be able to save themselves. And if that doesn't work, then you're talking about basically your Achilles heel in regards towards all this stuff that looked like the Trojan horse. It looked like that it was the gift of God's green earth in regards towards the internet and Twitter and all this other stuff that has rapidly increased stuff on warp speed that obviously they didn't put into play, that now it's kind of a like he said a while ago, it's a phenomenon in an area that they've never had to adjust to like this. So, the 2008 bubble burst, that was horrifying enough. That was bad enough. But increase that now probably about 20% towards how quickly people stood on their toes in hearing what was going on and immediately went to secure their investments, their deposits. Hey, we thought that the internet, with all this high-tech advanced technology that was basically dumped in our laps, that even to this day, people like myself and elderly people still struggle, and some of them won't even attempt to try to figure it out because they just don't want to activate their minds into it. But it was dumped into our laps. Originally, it was supposed to have been the best thing since, I guess, the existence of toilet paper. And now we're realizing that this Trojan horse that we thought was a good thing is actually backfiring on us. And it's having strong implications of negative reactions, not just with what we're talking about right here in stuff being handled warp speed, but with our children, with privacy rights pertaining to our people basically getting into fights or having, confrontations or divorces over. We've also got to worry about the insurance companies. If you got private insurance and they find out that you've been this way or you've been that way, the next thing you know, they'll come after you and they'll put you on a high risk rate that's even going to be more pricey than what it was with the lower price rate. As a matter of fact, I just got through having my insurance adjuster as of Friday because I had to go in there and reset something on my telephone that they're obviously more smart about doing than I am. And while he was in there, he said because of the price hikes with all the body shops and the hourly wages, and because of the price hikes with the parts and the materials, he said probably they'll have to go up on their rates this year in confiscating the differences. Once more, who gets it? Who gets it? It always rolls downhill, and it will be the consumer every time that winds up taking it on the cheek. Well, whenever you're already borderline poor, or you already are poor, and you can't stand no more, it's like you're really and truly set out to destroy us, aren't you? You really and truly don't know what you're doing, and rather than create something new or do something different, we're still kicking the can down the road pertaining to the national debt, raising the debt ceiling, and we're still $32 trillion in debt. Now, if somebody can't see that this is destroying lives, and I still blame the perpetrators of the oil industry that went right in behind COVID, thinking that they could play the same game again like they've done probably for the past 5 or 6 times in my lifetime, towards bumping the prices up and putting a squeeze on everybody. It just so happens this time the squeeze was too much of a squeeze. And now we're beginning to see the repercussions of that squeeze on top of what Putin is doing over there to the Ukrainians. That's only using up that many more resources on top of what's going on with our environment pertaining to massive forces of nature that's proportionally out of control because of how that, and I'm going to just be frank with you, how that the supernatural has deceived humanity pertaining to the greedy oil tycoons, that has put us in this uncomfortable position that in reality we should be all driving either hybrid or battery or solar or some sort of other energy, because the world right now is in an energy crisis. We are in an energy crisis because of so many people on the world. And I personally think that it's just a matter of time before we're going to be in a water crisis. I think we're already having water crisis in other continents. And last year, it was a water crisis right here. They claim that Lake Mead over there in Colorado River, it ain't filling up like they thought that it should be, even though they're getting big snows and big rains. So what's happening to our planet? It's evaporating. This stuff is evaporating. We thought that it was only the sun that was drawing this moisture out of our lakes and rivers and tributaries and etc. And it's a little of both. It's the sun drawing at the same time the planet is warming up, and as the planet warms up, it's kind of like steam. You know, if you're warming up a pot of water and you got it on low, you're going to have a low amount of steam that's coming out of the pan. But if you turn it up all the way, you'll see steam coming out of that dude like you ain't never believed. So as the world gets hotter and hotter, you'll see evaporations get quicker and quicker. That's just the law of logic pertaining to how things is kind of like the law of gravity.
Congressman, we'll be watching your upcoming hearing. Thank you. Face the Nation will be back in a minute. Stay with us.
I don't know how come our professors and smart people haven't already been able to look at this in a different point of view towards understanding what has gotten us in this tight to begin with. And the fact of the matter is you cannot borrow your way out of debt. And the fact of the matter is it was Bill Clinton that had a formula pertaining to the banking industry.
Right now, and see how much you
Pertaining to the banking industry, that out of 10 loans, as long as you could maintain 7 of them, at least 7, the banking industry would still float. Well, now the banking industry is putting on all these penalty fees and adding this fee and adding that fee, and people ain't even got enough money to even pay for the indebtedness that they're already in. And now they're talking about trickling down some more indebtedness upon to the American people, and they have taken all that they can take. They have stood all that they can stand. And obviously the big guy didn't understand the importance of the little guy, because without the little guy, the big guy don't survive. And now the big guy is trying to make up for lost time, because obviously he didn't have his eye on the ball right. And now he's thinking that he's going to be able to take it back out on the little guy. And the little guy has already done suffered immensely. The bankruptcy courts are full. People is behind on their mortgages and their house payments and their rent and their car payments. It's in a hither. As my mother used to always say, it's in a hither. And the oil companies are the biggest part of the blame because of what they tried to pull last year in driving the prices up. And I know for a fact some of those prices got as high as almost $10 a gallon out in California. Diesel fuel in Illinois, like $7, $8 a gallon. I mean, whenever you do that, you're going to destabilize the economy and the inflation.
Now, with the former top economic advisor in the Trump administration and currently the vice chairman of IBM, Gary Cohn. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret.
We should also say you also used to run Goldman Sachs many years ago. So that's why I want to talk to you about banking. But first, I want to ask you about the gentleman you used to work for, the 45th president, who may be indicted in the coming days. He's called for protests, and that's raising concerns about violence. Are you concerned about security and what will happen next?
Well, I'm anti-protest, so I don't think we should be protesting anything. I hope that America has learned from what has happened in the past, and I hope whatever happens next week, we just have a very peaceful set of events. You know, when it comes to this, like, no one is above the law, but there also may be some politics involved. So both of these things may be true.
Your own security. Are you concerned?
No, I'm not.
Living in Manhattan. So on the banking front, a week ago you said this looked like a simple run on a bank. It's continued, though, to put pressure on other banks. Why should we assume that other banks are better at managing risk than Silicon Valley Bank was?
Well, Margaret, bank runs are bank runs. Like when people lose confidence in a bank, deposits go out the door very quickly. Banks are not designed to have deposits go out in massive scale. In fact, banks are designed to take your deposits and reinvest them back in the economy. They give out mortgages, they give out car loans, they give out student loans, they allow you to have your credit cards. So there is not that much liquidity in a bank to allow that to happen. When confidence is gone, people say, look, I will take my money to someplace else where I have more confidence. And we are starting to see that run through the system. And there's a contagion effect. You say, okay, one bank has the problem, okay, another bank has the problem. Is the bank I'm in, is it safe? And if I have any doubt whatsoever that it's not safe, I'm going to move.
The thing about it is, it starts out with the banks, and then the next thing you know, big major corporations, like the last time that this happened, it didn't take Bill Hurd, which at the time was one of the biggest dealerships, Chevrolet dealerships in America, it didn't take him long to fold. So it trickles down. Other people will feel the brunt, and they'll feel it quickly, probably more so now because of the Twitter and internet, and it could literally scare the pants out of people. I mean, I hope to God that we don't see people committing suicide over this or jumping out of buildings like they did in 1929, but whenever people has all their assets in one particular basket, they got all their eggs in one basket, and this is what they're solely dependent upon pertaining to their golden years that they're going to live out, and now all of a sudden you forfeit all that, or you forfeit a lot of that, you're going to have some angry people, and you're going to have some very disappointed people that's going to think that they got shafted. And in reality, we all got shafted whenever the oil industries decided that they was going to do what they done last year. Why did they ever do that is still beyond me. I can go all the way back whenever I wasn't even driving a car. And they put out some sort of crazy thing about oil shortages, that the world was running out of oil, and that was the reason why that the oil prices was being driven up. And then, of course, in the late 70s, early 80s, they done the exact same thing. It basically caused so many mama and papa businesses to fold. I mean, you had all kinds of farms that just couldn't hold on, because usually whenever the price of fuel goes up, usually the interest rate goes up. Everybody's trying to backpedal because the big guys, they got payments to make too, pertaining to all their investments, pertaining to their yachts and their vacation homes and all this other stuff. And some of them's got private jets, and some of them's got big mansions. Some of them's light bill will run $10,000 a month. Well, whenever you're under that type of criteria, it don't take much before you're going to wind up hurting. And they know that. So they're playing the same old game, which is what? Let's shovel it on down to the working man. Well, the thing about it is, it was the working man that took the blow to begin with. And now they're trying to pass the buck, and I personally don't think there's no buck to pass, because we went through COVID. The oil industries hit this at the exact wrongest of the wrong time. Just like Putin over there doing what he's doing, he could not have chosen a worser time to have done that, by putting a strain on not just the Ukrainians and killing them the way that he was doing, but putting a strain on the UK and all that area over there that is basically taking it on the cheek. And whenever you do that, you're going to piss people off. Whenever people wind up losing their shirts on their back, you're going to piss people off.
To the safest place I can, because it's better safe than sorry when it's your own hard-earned dollar.
Let's talk about that contagion risk on the other side of this commercial break. Gary, stay with us. We will be right back.
People's going to have to use a little common sense. And I still say that the internet has really brought a whole lot of this into play.
Today,
Because before the internet, let's say in the 70s, even the beginning phases of the early 80s, we was doing real well for ourselves over here in America towards being the number one in the smokestack industry, being number one in the medical, being number one in the car manufacturing, being number one in the agriculture, being number one throughout the world. Well, as long as we was picking and choosing our fights towards competing with just a few people versus everybody, we was maintaining. But whenever they opened it up, suddenly the world got smaller. All of a sudden, here come NAFTA, but no one cared about free trade, or fair trade. They was only concerned about free trade, and they basically sold the American people downstream. Why? Because they got the cart in front of the horse in competing on a global level, to where if they would have stayed with where they was, we was maintaining. But you cannot compete, General Motors cannot compete towards paying some of their people $60 an hour compared to Mexico that barely pays them $12. And that's just one example. There's probably a trillion examples out there towards people making soap, making pajamas, making shoes, making watches, making telephones, making 2x4s, making compressed wood, making shingles. I mean, it could go on and on and on and on towards how that we have been outsourced, and we have been competing with the labor rate. We have been beaten in that area because we had already become established in our system over here, and our system was so much ahead of, let's say, Honduras or the Philippines or wherever. Our system was already that much more advanced and ahead, and because of the differences, it has caused a problem. And of course, your retail stores jumped right on top of all that whenever they started bringing in all these cheap goods that, yeah, everybody filled their houses up full of a bunch of junk. Stuff that most of us only use once or twice and throw it off in the corner and don't ever use it again. But whenever it comes to our labor, whenever it comes to our future, whenever it comes to our children, whenever it comes to us not being $32 trillion in debt, I don't have to explain to you why that happened. For surely to God, you can see that. And I'm not what you would call a financial analyst in regards to all this, but I am intelligent enough to understand where America took a left-hand turn whenever they should have took a right. Where America took a left-hand turn throughout the Reagan era that has put us where we are today. And if you'll topple that off with a 20-year war, and then Desert Storm War, Desert Shield War, if you'll top that off with 9/11, if you'll top that off with all the other bad luck that's occurred here in America, there you go. Where's your sign? If you can't see, if you can't place all the dots together towards seeing what's happening here, either you don't want to see it, or maybe you're incapable of seeing it. I don't know. But obviously, the power players, the rich man, the 1%ers now has been shaken. And whenever Mr. Putin said what he said, probably within the first 30 days of the war, that he answered somebody and said, well, that may be so, but the ground that you're walking on just shifted. Once more, if you'll combine that with COVID, what the oil typhoons have done on top of the war, yes, sir, the ground shifted. And it shifted in areas unexpectedly and unintentionally that these smart people, that these high-to-do people was not anticipating. And now it has caught them off guard. And if you'll add the internet, Twitter, fear factoring, fear mongering, all that in there together, bingo, you got the perfect storm, just like Winston Churchill said, the perfect storm. In other words, it was unpreventable.
Today marks the 20th anniversary of the start of the war in Iraq. The ground war lasted weeks, but U.S. military involvement in that country continues to this day. Our Charlie D'Agata's report on life in Iraq now is on our website at facethenation.com.
Now there's another failure. We went over there in the intentions towards what? Going to eradicate the axis of evil and trying to bring stability to that area. Well, China has made a move in that area that hopefully their works will not be in vain, but 20 years later, they're still at war with one another over there. They're still fighting and killing one another just like it was before, if not worse now than what it was before we ever went in there.
.com. My primary.
We're going to have to reinvent. Going to have to reinvent. People's going to have to stand in line, and
from IVF to menopause, we're shedding.
And I'm just afraid that the tough times has not hit yet. Because if this thing comes unraveled the way that I'm thinking it is, it could get very, very tough for a whole lot of people. And I ain't just talking about the poor class or the working class. I'm talking about all the classes. It could get very, very tough for a great deal of people all over the planet. And usually whenever that occurs and people's bellies start swelling up because of lack of food, usually attitudes get twisted and all out of shape, and the next thing you know, yeah, you're calling on the fact of possibly a major confrontation of a major war, a third world war. You let people go to starving to death that hadn't been adjusted to starving to death. You let people do without this and do without that. You'll see what type of attitude that they get real quick.
Welcome back to Face the Nation, and we continue our conversation now with former Trump economic advisor Gary Cohn. Gary, I want to pick up on where we just left off. In terms of stopping the...
And I don't agree with what he said a while ago pertaining to he didn't believe in protest. Maybe he should have worded himself a little differently and said that he didn't believe in this type of protest pertaining to what Donald Trump is trying to implement to our country over here. But I do believe in protest. I do believe that people should have the right to be able to talk. They should have the right to criticize. They should have the right to voice their opinions. I don't think that they should have the right to get violent. I don't think that they should have the right to make people's lives hard because of them voicing their opinions. But I personally think that protesting is a good thing, because without protesting, our democracy as we know it today would not have existed if it weren't for people that was willing to stand up and say enough is enough and we don't have to take it no more.
And that continues to be happening for some of these mid-sized banks like First Republic. Is there a white knight? Does this only end when one of the big banks buys it up?
Margaret, most likely that will be the scenario. At the end of the day, the banks that are most qualified and have the most secure and soundest balance sheets that can afford to absorb some of these larger regional banks.
It kind of reminds me whenever all the farmers was going out of business. I'm just going to use the farming industry for an example here. In the early 80s, whenever all these mama papa farms was going out of business, that some of them farmed 60 acres, some of them farmed 45 acres, some of the big ones farmed somewhere around 160 to 220 acres. But then whenever all that stuff happened in the late 70s, early 80s, my God, they had auctioneers sales everywhere, probably 2 or 3 a week around this area. And it was happening all over America. And what they was doing was weaning out the weak and weaning out the small. And then all of a sudden, what happened? You had your mega farmers. You had farmers that if you wasn't farming at least 8, 9, maybe 1,000 acres, you wasn't even considered hardly a farmer. And some of these farmers around here are probably farming 4,000 or 5,000 acres. And if you go out west, out in places like Kansas, they're up there around 10 or 12, 15,000 acres per farm. So they weaned out the little guy. Well, what did the retail stores do? Kmart, Walmart, Big K, all the other major chains. What did they do? They killed the mama and papa business retail stores to the degree that they said that they was doing it for convenience, and they put everything under the same roof, in which that's fine. But now I'm seeing these same people that was worried about low prices, all American, low prices, all American, that now they're driving their prices up as much, if not more, than what everybody else is. It's unbelievable.
Are the largest banks in America, which in an ironic way is the last thing that the regulatory